I'm on mute too. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's production for Batdorf and Bronson Coffee Roasters and and our Dancing Goats retail affiliates. Dancing Goats, of course, is the name of our stores, our retail stores. Um, so I wanted to say hello to you all. It is 9 a.m. here on the West Coast, noon on the East Coast. Hello to everyone between those two coasts and on those two coasts. It's great to have you here this morning for what is really a pretty unique program that we're going to do today. So today we got a request about 2.5, 3 weeks ago from one of our fans to talk about tea. And at first, I was a little like, oh, okay, we're not a tea company. But then I recognized, tea has always been a part of our coffee shop experience. And we've done all sorts of things with tea. We've brought in our own tea and done our own purchasing and then rebranded it. We've used small tea companies, large tea companies. So we've had a long experience with always having tea alongside coffee in the coffee shops. And we know that we absolutely have customers who come in and have tea at our coffee shops. So it's great to have that request and to decide, yeah, let's talk about tea. So what I decided to do was just for full transparency, before I started working for Batdorf and Bronson, I had opened a tea company myself. Now I'm going to be clear, it was a tisane and tea company, which Jeff and I might actually talk a little bit about. Um, so a tisane is what we often refer to as herbal teas or herbal infusions. But as a part of that, we also started carrying teas. And the funny thing is, really, it started with mostly a focus on herbals. Um, but then customers started asking about tea, and so we started dipping our toe into teas. And I learned so much over the 6 years that I was part of that operating team. I'm no longer an owner of that company, just to be clear, because I will be using their tea, and we'll give the company credit for sure because they are awesome. And I'm not just saying that because I was part of the founding group, but I got to meet amazing people as I learned about tea because I'd come from coffee. And one of those folks that I got to meet was Jeffrey McIntosh. Now, Jeffrey McIntosh has a Facebook page right now called Puer and Tea Enthusiasts. And I want to ask him a little bit about that name along with a lot of other things as I introduce him today. So I want to say hello to you, Jeff. How are you doing today? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you all right. I'm doing quite well.
Oh,
Great
good.
to have me on here. Thanks so much. This will be fun
Yeah. It's good to see you. It's good to see you.
already.
So, Jeff,
Likewise.
I met you about, I think, what would it be, 11 years ago?
12?
12 years ago?
12 or 11 years ago. Wow.
Yeah. And
Time has flown.
yeah.
That's when I was working on my first company.
So I've been referring to you as I've talked about what we're going to do today as a tea master. Would you claim that title for yourself?
I don't usually feel comfortable with that title. I do feel that I've been very lucky and fortunate here in the US to get the amount of knowledge and skill set from studying from other tea masters. And I think that word gets thrown around a lot. And I think a better word is maybe a tea expert. I think a tea master is a lifelong journey. There's just so much to learn and uncover, as you also probably have to do with coffee. There's just a whole world. So outside of Chinese tea, there's even teas that also grown in Japan, Korea, but I specifically focus on Chinese tea and a niche varietal known as Puer. But today I'll talk about all 6 varieties of Chinese tea.
Well, I'm going to do a little something, a surprise I didn't tell you about today, and I'll show you. Ooh, mine. So this is Puer tea. And so I just wanted to, we'll start off when I say that you have a Facebook page that's really it's a group that allows people to come together and share knowledge. You're really focused on education and knowledge around teas, but you
Yes,
do call it Puer and tea, and I thought that was interesting. So can you tell us a little bit about the distinction between Puer and tea, and maybe that can help us start understanding some of the processing issues you wanted to focus on today as well.
absolutely. And so I'll kind of do a brief introduction. So I've been kind of a serial entrepreneur and opened multiple companies, all based in loose leaf tea. I've been sourcing, I built supply chains in China. I've been very fortunate to travel throughout China and learn and become fluent in Mandarin Chinese. So I've seen a lot of the processes of tea and sold and imported teas of all genres. What started to happen on my journey was I learned a lot about white, green, and oolong, but slowly I got introduced to Puer. And Puer tea is particularly unique because, yes, all tea in the world does come from the same plant, Camellia sinensis. But the teas we're familiar with, white teas, green teas, oolong teas, black teas, those are coming from Camellia sinensis variety sinensis, which is a very common variety that's grown anywhere in the world. It's also very durable. But in southwest China, in a province known as Yunnan, it grows Camellia sinensis variety Assamica. And this is a unique variety that can only grow in Yunnan, not to be confused with Assam tea in India. It's still quite different. This is grow. Some of these tea trees are hundreds of years old. Some even can grow thousands of years. And the reason they can do that is because there's a very unique biodiverse ecosystem that allows these trees to grow naturally without human intervention. So without pesticides or herbicides. So these old tea trees have a very, very deep root structure. And this allows these teas to be picked, sun-dried, and processed in that tea cake that Joshua pulled up and pressed that way, and then aged, so post-fermented. So what's the difference between tea and Puer? Well, teas, white teas, green teas, oolongs, they're picked, sun-dried, and then kill green. So it's a stop oxidation process. This is what gives green tea such a beautiful color, aromatic qualities. But because of that sharp kill green, you're stopping the oxidation at 3 or 4 or 5%, and you're allowing that tea to release its aroma, but it has a shelf life. So it will go bad after a few weeks or a few months. It'll slowly decay over time. But with Puer, the tea is picked, sun-dried, and a special killing process to make sure all the enzymes are still alive. So when it is indeed pressed into a tea cake, it can start a very natural and slow post-fermentation process and can be aged like a drinkable tea. And so that's one thing that makes Puer tea so unique.
I I think that's really a great place to start a conversation about the similarities between coffees and teas. So my understanding, as I learned from you and other people in tea who are just have volumes of knowledge, was that tea, like you said, comes from the same plant, Camellia sinensis, variety sinensis, but there also was another commercially viable form, Camellia sinensis, variety Assamica, and what I had never known until I started drinking tea more was that when I thought of white tea, green tea, oolong tea, black tea called red tea, when I thought of those, they weren't different types of plant. They were just different lengths and processes involving oxidation of the same plant, and that was like really mind-blowing to me because I could relate to that from coffee, because with coffee we really have two commercially viable types of coffee. We have Cafe Arabica and we have Cafe Robusta, right? So the differentiation is a little stronger other than from the varietal standpoint. But then within varietals of Cafe Arabica, we start going into a wide range of different varieties of that coffee. But they're all the same. They all kind of come back to the same root. And what really makes a differentiation for them is terroir, farming practices, clearly, and then processing in the same sense, right? And that's just like processing can really terroir and farming practices and processing can transform the same tea leaf into a very different sensual experience. The same thing is true with coffee, right? It's really the same core plant, but it's the human interactions with it that cause it to be so very different across all the different types that we're familiar with.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's such a unique thing because essentially just the region and the processing that's making that Camellia sinensis turn into a white or a black tea, and also the time it's picked, and also what part of the plant is being picked, and what stage or extent of the oxidation.
Got it. I'm going to adjust some mic stuff a little bit here for you, just because I'm getting
No
a little
worries.
feedback on from the group here. So trying to make it a little bit better for their listening experience. I'm turning my volume up and setting yours a little bit lower. So one of the things that that really surprised me when I was introduced to Puer tea was just the depth of it, like the experience of the flavor, and how it was very different from other teas that I'd had. What do you think attributes to that? What is that attributed to?
And it's really a good question because most people's experience with Puer can vary greatly depending on how they're exposed to it. In overall, there were two types of Puer. There is raw Puer, which has been around the longest, and that tea is picked, sun-dried, and pressed. It has a green-like color. That tea will be almost a golden yellow liquid. It'll be kind of a golden floral-like aroma, and it's good to drink in the hotter weather. And then there's ripe Puer, which is far more common. Most people have encountered this tea. This was developed in the 1970s. And what they're doing is they're picking and sun drying, but they're adding an additional step known as wet piling, which is a fermentation type of process. This can last 4 to 6 weeks to accelerate the aging process to get that to resemble that of a very, very old raw. But now, of course, the techniques have gotten to such a point, it's no longer just trying to resemble older raw. It's really its own category. So you have raw and ripe. Ripe tends to be a ruby red-like color. It should have an herbal, almost strong Chinese medicine characteristic. And the taste profile of Puer is so unique because it's more of a feeling in the body. Now, at first, when you hear this, it's a little strange, but maybe you can relate that to the feeling you drink when you drink a cup of coffee. It's very tasty, but you're also getting some stimulation through the body. Now, with Puer, depending on the type of tree or how old the tree is, that stimulation may be more energetic, or if it's from an older tea tree, can be very calming. But it's a very body experience. It should be comfortable and soothing. So it goes a little bit beyond the taste profile. And I think this is why so many people are attracted to Puer. And of course, you can age it.
I think that aging issue, we talked about that a little bit last week, is really important. I want to talk for a moment, though, what you just mentioned about the body sensation. I know that, there are different coffees that I drink that because of the aroma and some intrinsic qualities in the coffee, specifically I think around the way it affects my palate, it gives me a different body sensation. For me, probably the key one is when I drink Indonesian coffees, when I drink Sumatran coffee, something from Papua New Guinea, maybe even, there's a quality to those coffees that, and it's probably just me as an individual, my reaction to it is, it really, the stimulation feels very different. It's much more kind of heady stimulation, more snap and crackle for me. And I don't know what that is about those qualities, but it definitely gives me a different experience of the coffee than if I drink, a Latin American that has a more pronounced acidity, or if I drink an African coffee that's really fruity. I'll have very different I was so happy. I was
I
so
got a
hoping
little
that would
friend.
happen today. I'm waiting for my son to come in and ask me about Minecraft. So we're equal there. Um, so uh, so yeah, so I totally can understand why people have different body experiences around these beverages because it's almost like it's this deep relationship between humans and their environment and the tea or coffee and its environment too, right? I know that's getting into a little woo woo, but I think all of us have those different relationships with our coffee. The cat wants to be in the show.
That's right. He wants to be a superstar. I think this is a really good point because I think with coffee and Puer, there's also a lot of misconceptions. I think if you haven't had a good experience with a certain beverage like coffee or Puer, maybe your first experience wasn't desirable. Maybe it was very jittery. It was kind of a not desirable taste. And unfortunately, with Puer, that's very common. Raw Puer tends to be very bitter and astringent. And what will happen is people will drink that, get very stimulated, and think Puer tea is very bitter. But and then they'll drink right Puer, and it'll have a very nasty, kind of earthy, dirty taste. And I do want to encourage everyone. There's so much Puer tea out there in the world that it's true. Over 97% of Puer is coming from smaller bushes, where less than 3% is coming from older tea trees. And in my experience, in the last now I want some tea in my experience in the last 10 years, I have noticed that there is a lot of uncomfortable, not tasty Puer. But you have to think about if there are people willing to pay a lot of money for a tea or a Puer tea, there has to be a reason. And so good Puer should always be clean, meaning it should have a translucent color. It should have a beautiful like aroma, and it should be very comfortable in the body, meaning when you drink it, you should.
That's great.
So I just want to, if you haven't found a cup of tea,
Yeah. That
go ahead.
reminds me of my first experience drinking Puer with you. And I want to call out that there are some folks asking right now about the clarification on pronunciation of Puer. And so a lot of us
So yeah,
often
I can
say
quickly touch on that.
Puer. I know I do, but I hear you're saying Puer.
So yeah, in Chinese it's spelled Puer. That's the pinyin. It's Puer. But in America, you'll see the West Niles version be used a lot, which they add an H, which is Puer. Now, whether which one is correct or not, both are commonly used here in the West. And I personally use the Pu-erh just because it's easier to say and pronounce.
Got it. Thank you. I want to get back on that aspect of there's two things that I think are similar. You talk about the one of the benefits of Puer being that the aging allows it to have a longer shelf life and thus a longer life for us to enjoy. Correct? Um, and
Yes.
and also you were talking about people having a first experience with a tea or a coffee maybe that really was less than positive. And I know that with coffee for the last really 40 years, there's been like a really a transformation. And I'll toot our horn, of course, because I'm here on behalf of the company that I love, that I get to work with, the people I get to work with. Backdoor from Bronson was really among the pioneers doing this about transforming the way we understood coffee as this thing which is mass produced, ground up, staled, so they can be shipped across the U.S. And then just thrown into 10 pounds is bought all at once, and you just you just use it up, and it's you may not like the taste of it, but it gets you up in the morning. And there was a transformation of people reaching down into farming communities and learning that there were all these varieties and nuances and elements within coffee which were actually culinary, right? That it was actually something that could be experienced not as a commodity, but as an aesthetic and culinary thing, and beginning to narrow, select out those coffees and then talk about not just the sourcing them and all those practices that go into down at the farm level, producing ripe cherries that have the right ability to be roasted, but then roasting them correctly, and then hoping to educate people around how to make the coffees so that when they drink it, they're not having their experience of coffee be bitter, right? because coffee really, even coffees that are roasted quite dark on the profile of roasting, shouldn't be bitter per se. They should be sweet, and there should be a lightness to them. And so we've watched in the coffee industry as our approach to making coffee has been responding to what a lot of folks have had as a first experience, right? And they just kind of shrug it and accept it. And we're saying, no, no, there's all these different ways to interact with this coffee that will create a much more delicate and enjoyable experience rather than being just a cup of mud in the morning. So it's interesting, that there's a very similar thing to consider when we're looking at teas as well.
And this is so interesting because it's the processing that's so important. You have to think about how it's processed, what plant, and then how it's being shipped, how it's being stored, which I think is similar to coffee, and then also how you're preparing it. You can maybe have a pretty decent tea or coffee, but if it's not brewed correctly, you may miss some nuances. And so I think there's just a lot of overlay, which also brings, towards the end of this live stream, we will do a demonstration on how you can get better flavors when brewing a green tea. And we're going to have a method on how you all at home can brew that green tea and avoid some of those bitterness or acidic qualities that sometimes appear in green tea.
I think that's absolutely a key distinction, because I know it models my own education. When I learned about how teas change as they oxidize, and the picking, withering, drying process, and then the kill green stage, which causes the denaturing of those elements in the tea, is what fixes it in its state, whether it's white, green, oolong, black, along that spectrum. And then what you just said, there are some things we have to do when we get it to our cup that are going to affect it. Because I'd always thought, I don't like green tea, it's too bitter. No, I was not brewing it correctly. That was the issue was. I was brewing it too hot and too long, right? And so when folks hear us sometimes in the coffee world, we geek out about our our temperatures and our weight ratios and our grind size. It's all part of that same kind of approach, is that we really are working to get what's best and what is most admirable out of that coffee, to nurse it out. And this last phase, after all the care and work has gone into farming, picking, processing, getting it to us, right? And then roasting. So it's great. And the tea totally taught me that. And green tea specifically. So green tea is a great place to focus. And by the way, people are loving your pink stag kettle. Great item.
This is pour over coffee. Well, we're using it for tea.
Yeah. Well, I'll show you kind of what I have going on over here. So I have a green tea. Now, I had mentioned that I had a Dragon Well. Do you want to talk a little bit about Dragon Well? And this is a Dragon Well, which I purchased from B. Fuller's Mortar and Pestle, which was mentioned in our comments. But would you like to share a little bit about Dragon Well in general, what you've learned about it?
Sure, yeah. Dragon Well is a green tea that goes through a pan firing process. So this tea is picked, sun-dried, and then pan fired. And what you'll see is these leaves would be very, very flat and long, almost like a flattened leaf. And this tea is known for its color and aromatics. So those are the two first things before the taste, because this tea has a very, very beautiful color and aromatic quality, but it also is very time sensitive because the oxidation is maybe only 2 or 3%. So this tea, if you were able to visit where this tea is grown, which is in Hongzhou, and it's also Westlake, there's a beautiful lake there, and there's little tea gardens all around that are producing this particular type of tea. You will often see, after it's been picked and processed, they can, of course, use gaiwans or sometimes cups to brew the tea. But what's very common is to have a glass cup, a simple glass cup, and they would measure out 2 or 3 grams of this tea. And what you want to do when you brew this tea is essentially fill up your glass cup, almost all the way with a little bit lower temperature. So we want to use something around 175 to 185 degrees Fahrenheit. The reason you want to use a lower temperature is because this tea is very fragile and delicate. Now, you can think about cooking. If you use too high of a temperature, you can scald the leaves, you can burn the leaves. And what will happen is too much of that tannin content, that bitterness, the stringency will come out at a higher temperature. So by controlling the temperature with these fragile leaves, using that lower temperature, you're going to be able to reduce the bitterness. And then the next thing you want to do is you want to actually fill up this cup first. You want to fill it up with water before placing tea. The reason is by filling up the water first, you don't apply too much pressure and you do not agitate the leaves too much. So all we're doing is going to fill up this cup.
Am I going to fill it all the way up, Jeff?
You can do just comfortable enough so you can still hold it and drink from it.
Right. So I want to point out, you know, you'll see on my down shot here, and Jeff mentioned it, he just talked about the importance of water temperature. You know, we're using a Bonavita variable temp kettle. I'll move this out of the way so you can see. You can see that I chose a slightly higher temperature for my Dragon Well, but 177 degrees. Now that is, of course, significantly lower in temperature than we use for coffee extraction. But the key thing is being able to control that temperature, which is why those variable temperature kettles are so important. And I learned that again. I learned that from you.
And yeah, any pour over coffee variable temperature kettle would be great. I actually just produced a YouTube video that talks about different types of variable kettles, a review and comparison if you want to check out on YouTube. But next, all you want to do is you want to take these leaves. And what we're going to do is we're going to slowly slide them in on top of the water. And this is kind of called dancing the leaves, because all the leaves are going to do is they're going to slowly settle in to the water and then slowly start to fall. And so it's just slowly brewing. And usually they want a tall, slim glass so you can appreciate that color. Another unique thing is you're going to see that color kind of disperse down through the glass, which is really beautiful. And you can also smell the aroma now because it's starting to be released. And this is one thing that's made Longjing so famous, is it has this really kind of soft, almost floral or grassy-like aroma, and you're going to have a really beautiful golden green color as it brews.
I can see the color, and folks may be able to see it as well. It's beginning to move down through our cup.
And you just kind of wait, and you don't have to worry too much about overbrewing, because how this tea is sometimes enjoyed is they'll wait for the leaves kind of to settle, and then they'll sip on the water. And what they'll do is when the water gets down to about half or a quarter way, they'll add in a little bit more fresh water. And you can get about 1 to 2 infusions. Green teas, you usually can get 1, 2, or 3 infusions from the same leaves, which is very unique about loose leaf tea. But when you go into other categories like Puer, something that's remarkable about these teas is you can easily sometimes get more than a dozen infusions. And that's why Puer tea is another unique characteristic.
Yeah. So I had a question from Brendan here. He's saying that he's had experiences with Pu-erhs where he has like almost like a little bit of a fish sauce quality coming up from them. What would be your recommendation on how to control for maybe some of those qualities or elements of that, which maybe come from just the aging process?
Yes. So this is a very difficult subject. It's very complex, and there's a lot of, unfortunately, misinformation around Puer. And the fishiness characteristic you're describing, unfortunately, is far too common. But in a good quality ripe Puer, what you're looking for is the color of the liquid should be translucent. It can be very dark. It could be almost black or golden red, but it should be translucent. If there is cloudiness or opaqueness, this would be an undesirable characteristic. Where that fishiness comes from, this is actually an undesirable aroma. It should be herbal or Chinese medicine. The reason fishiness often appears is during the wet pile process. So if you think about the economics of ripe pour, I apologize if this goes kind of very deep into this subject, but in order to produce ripe pour, you have to process the tea in a wet pile, which needs a minimum of 1,000 kilos of production. And then it needs to sit for 4 to 6 weeks while constantly being maintained and rotated. And then they need to add in water. And this is happening in China. So if you're purchasing a ripe pour, you want to make sure you're purchasing from a professional factory that has clean access to clean water, which in China is not as easy. And you want to make sure the factory is cleaning their factory properly and also has a team or staff or fermentation master overlooking that pile. If that pile is not properly maintained, maybe they didn't use enough financial resources to maintain that pile, it'll be left unattended. And it may develop characteristics of fishiness, dustiness, antiquiness, and some people will say that is a wet pile taste, and it should go away in 4 to 5 years. But in my experience, what you want to look for in a ripe pour, even if it is very young, is it should have a very clean color, a very strong herbal Chinese medicine or ginseng-like aroma. It can be very strong, but it should not be unpleasant or fishy. And the last thing is it should be able to produce multiple infusions and have a strong aroma and taste profile. So if you drink a ripe pour that has something that is undesirable to you, that is unpleasant to you, it does not necessarily mean it is bad or good, but you may want to look for another ripe pour that is more suitable for your body type and taste profile. And of course, if you want to learn more information about distinguishing the quality of pour, I do have a Patreon, Jeffrey McIntosh. I also have a free Facebook group, Pour and Tea Enthusiasts, and a free YouTube channel, which I talk more about this subject. Pour tea is a vast world, and what we've seen in the West is just a very small picture of the beauty and potential of this tea.
That's great to know, Jeff. And I think it's also important to remember when if you're going out and purchasing teas, usually you'll be in a space where they're more than happy to share the tea with you before you make a purchase. They're more than happy to sit with you and enjoy some of the tea they're offering you, and then that's the time when you can absolutely make those determinations. It's the same reason like we have a tasting room, right? We want people to be able to come in and try our coffees. It makes perfect sense to be able to do that, so you can look at that clarity. We would say the same thing, that we're always trying to control for non-water solubles in our brew methods, right? Because they can influence the way that the coffee sits on your palate and the way you experience it, and they can override or overwhelm other qualities of the coffee. We usually use filtration, but also brewing methods to control for that. One thing I want to hit on when you were talking about the wet piling, that reminds me of one of the processes that we have in coffee. We have three kind of big streams for the way coffee, no pun intended, the way coffee is processed. Once they pick the fresh cherry, and we're trying to get to that seed inside that cherry, they can use what's called the washed or wet method, where they pulp the fruit, the skin and fruit off, and then soak the mucilage covered seed in water for a period of time to break down that mucilage, pass it through a washing channel, and then sun dry or mechanically dry that seed. And then we have our coffee seed. The other way, on the other end of the spectrum, is called the dry method. And the dry method, we pick that coffee cherry, and then instead of depulping it, instead of taking off the pulpa and the skin, they'll take the whole cherry and lay it out in the sun, often on raised beds, for that very thing you were just mentioning about the care it takes in really managing the wet piling of Puer, because it has to be intensely managed, because we have fresh fruit sitting in the sun in the tropics. and if we just lay it out there in a pile without turning it, without ensuring airflow, without managing it really meticulously, necessarily the fruit is going to experience different levels of oxygen, and that can lead to spoiling, it can lead to molding, and if they're not managing it, that will transfer all the way down into that seed of that coffee. So it's interesting that those are similar things. We have to make sure that the sources we're getting our beautiful teas and coffees from are following through on that careful management.
Yeah. And I think one thing I kind of leave everyone with is how to, when we purchase tea, one thing we often overlook. It's changing a lot in coffee already, but I don't think it's changing yet in the world of tea, is how we perceive tea. Tea is an agricultural product for the most part that is coming from China. And so if we reflect, oh, tea is so tasty, but if we reflect on food, where we get our food, there's a huge trend in organic food, clean food. We double think about where was this food grown? Is there pesticides or herbicides? And how likely is it to be of high quality at this price point? And we should apply that same thinking towards tea. There is so much tea coming from China. And I'll tell you, since I've been in the business myself, it's quite shocking sometimes how easy it is to get almost any genre of tea at any price point. So what you want to think about is the raw material used in a very labor intensive picking, sun drying, sometimes intensively processing, and then again shipped over here for us to enjoy in our cup. You should always go, like Joshua said, to test out the tea, experience it. How is the taste? How is the feeling in the body? And another rule I really like for tea, because it's more of a central body experience, is to apply something I've called a 3-day rule. Sometimes you need to drink the same tea just by itself for 1, 2, or 3 days, so you can be sure that that tea is giving your body what reaction. If we drink 4 or 5 or 6 teas in one day, it's very difficult to understand, is this tea making my stomach a little uncomfortable? Do I have a headache? So by separating that, experiencing that with your body, and tasting that tea, always buying in small amounts before you buy a lot to make sure it's agreeable with your body type. And one last thing with Puer is you never want to buy Puer in hopes it will turn into something you don't like the day you drink it. A lot of people will say things like aging potential, it has a great future, it needs to be bitter, aggressive, and strong, so it will turn into something beautiful in old age. In my experience, the last 10, 12 years, I have noticed that those teas tend to keep all of those characteristics. You want to purchase and drink a tea that is so desirable and tasty when you drink it, and as it ages, it will develop and become something more beautiful.
Great advice. So here we have our green tea that's been steeping for, gosh, almost 12 minutes now.
That's why we got to use that lower temperature that we can prevent those.
Absolutely true, because yeah, I am tasting it now, and that lower temperature has allowed the tea to not over extract or become bitter. It really has made a very pleasant cup of tea, and it's nice to see. We often, we do the same thing in coffee. We make all sorts of special tools and special ways to do coffee, and components of all of that have truth in them, right? That there are special things we want to always be paying attention to with the fundamentals. But at the end of the day, it's putting coffee into hot water. It's a little trickier for us because we have to grind it, right? Which does make for a slurry effect. Whereas with tea, this is great. It's simply, we just put the right temperature of water, tea into the right temperature of water, and we have a lovely experience without all of the fretting and the hassle, right? How nice is that for it to be that simple? Jeff, thank
and
you.
those of you that have a gaiwan at home or
yeah.
teapot, you can do this same method. Just put the water in first and then pour the tea on top.
Real quick, can you just talk a little bit about the gaiwan, just since we have you here for the last few minutes?
Absolutely. So this is a very traditional way to prepare tea. It's called the gaiwan, which just literally means lid and bowl. So it's a lid, a bowl, and the foundation. And this is a unique way to control the brewing process. So you put the tea leaves in here. It almost acts like a teapot, except you manually hold the gaiwan. And what you're going to do is pour the water in and then pour it out. And one hit for using a gaiwan is, I'll kind of show you, before you pick up and pour the gaiwan, what you want to do is you want to manually adjust the lid. And once you have a small gap in the lid, you hold from both sides and you hold the lid in position, and then you pour. So once I pick up the gaiwan, I don't have to maneuver the lid. I've already placed the lid with a slight gap. I'm just holding that and I'm pouring off into the the chahai or tea pitcher. And what this does is it separates the tea leaves from the water so you can do multiple infusions.
That's great. Um, so, Jeff, I want to thank you again for being here. It's such great. It's been such a great experience to have you as my friend and also a colleague in beverage. Even though we have two different beverages, it's nice to be able to talk a little bit about what they share and some of the similarities. And we could probably have another dozen of these conversations. And I'd love to talk more with you about it because I think it's good for folks to learn like these principles which are shared between these two very popular drinks. So thank you for being with us today, and I'll remind everyone that we've put a link to Puer and Tea Enthusiasts. There you can go follow Jeff, follow his videos, instructional materials, and then also there's a link for his Patreon there as well if you'd like to learn more as you educate yourself about teas and Puers maybe even especially. Jeff, thank you so much for being with us today.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks so much. It was always great. I always think tea and coffee can be symbiotic. You don't have to choose one or the other. They both have a beautiful world to explore.
That's awesome. So true. Thanks again. Folks, stay with me for a minute. Jeff, take care. We're going to say goodbye now, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Well, take care. Bye-bye.
Folks, thank you so much for being here, though. We want to remove this so Jeff can go about his business. I loved the cat. I couldn't have scripted that, right? So what a great level of education now for us to have learned about this whole other world, right? We get so wrapped up in what we're doing with coffee. It's nice to step out a little bit. I think we could have a similar conversation about chocolate. So I'll work on that and we'll see if we can bring someone in. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about our tea purveyor. Now I've used tea from B. Fuller's, Mortar and Pestle, but we also have great teas in our shops, and they're by Numi Tea. We're going to put a link for Numi Tea up here so you can go learn about them. We don't sell them online, but that's okay because you can come into our stores and have tea there, and many of you already are. But definitely, you know, we took a lot of time and care, a team of people, in this next choice we made for the teas that we have in our stores. And you'll see if you go and look at Numi Tea and learn a little bit about their company. You know, Jeff talked about some of the economics around tea and around you know, what's happening and where tea is being produced and the trust levels that we have to have with producers. And you know, in our case, we're the folks who get to do that. You know, Bob goes down and has those relationships and sees what's happening on farms, tastes coffees right there. That's also necessary, I think, when you're working with tea. Now, if you have a tea shop you like to go to and you taste the teas there, you get to do what Jeff was talking about judging the tea yourself. That's obviously, we have to do that. But it's also good to have a relationship with a tea purveyor that you know is doing that. And we feel that Numi really is. They really are stepping into that space to be able to provide that level of communication and connection to endpoint farmers, right? To the people who are actually producing these great beverages. So by all means, go check out their website and come enjoy their tea in our shops when you can, and enjoy tea at home as well. I'd love to have Jeff back on again. That was a great talk. And again, I think I'll work on looking into chocolate as well, because I think there are also some similarities that I've kind of learned a little bit about over my time. And maybe I can find somebody from Cho or Theo maybe. So let us know if you'd like to do that. Remember also that if you need to get a kettle, you can go to our website. We have a link for variable temperature kettles that we offer on the website. 10% off works on those too. So by all means, if you have to get yourself a kettle, go and do it. Get it from the website. Grab some coffee while you're at it as well, and you'll get 10% off on the whole purchase by using Watch and Learn 10. It's been great to help us stay educated as we turn our homes into coffee and tea shops. Take care. We'll see you tomorrow.